Okay, so let me just restate. You've written that the welfare state, despite all the advances, deals with the symptoms of our discontent as opposed to the source of our discontent. Just expand on that and explain what you mean by that.
Sure. Well, if we talk about something like poverty, I think the most important thing we should recognize that poverty is not a lack of character, but just a lack of cash. So in my book, I go over all the evidence we have from economics, from all sorts of experiments that happened since the 70s that show that eradicating poverty by just giving people money, going at the root of the problem and solving it with this medicine called money, works really, really well. But so often what we're doing in practice is that we're, trying to do something about the symptoms, right? We invest in education, all these courses that are supposed to help people make better decisions. That's not really solving the real issue, which is that poverty is just a lack of cash. And in so many cases, we should just hand out the salaries of the people that are trying to help the poor, because the real experts on the poor's lives are the poor themselves. It's just that they don't have the money.
Let's talk a little bit about the and you give a considerable amount of, at the very least, data and evidence. Let's talk about what you call Mincome Canada, which I think I think maybe to a certain extent we've talked about a little bit or touched on on this program. But tell us about the experiment in Canada, and which I don't think most people realize. There was also experiments in this country with simply paying poor people money so they won't be poor.
Yeah, not many people know that at the end of the 60s in the United States, almost everyone believed that some form of guaranteed basic income was going to be implemented. Everyone was in favor of it, from the left to the right. At some point there was a letter in the New York Times signed by 1,000 economists who all said, we got to end poverty in this country. And then in the early 70s, Richard Nixon, of all people, said, you know what, if everyone's in favor of this, let's do it. It's a pretty bizarre history. This bill went through the House of Representatives twice, and it was only killed in the Senate by Democrats, not because they didn't like the idea of eradicating poverty, but because they wanted a higher basic income. So yeah, this is a pretty fascinating history. It was also in this period that in North America, you had as much as 5 big basic income experiments. And indeed, one of them was, as you mentioned, in this small town in Canada, the Mincome experiment.
Well, tell us a little bit about that experiment.
Okay, so this started in 1974. A big experiment, a town where poverty was just completely eradicated. So as soon as you fell below the poverty line, your income would be automatically topped up. Now, there were lots of anthropologists and economists and sociologists who all moved into that town to monitor the effect. And they gathered a lot of data, did a lot of interviews for 4 years. But after 4 years, there was a problem. A new government was voted into power, and they didn't really like the experiment, or the idea of just giving people free money. So what they did is they canceled the whole thing, and there was no money left to analyze the results. So there were 2,000 boxes full of data that had to be put away in the archive, and then basically everyone forgot about it. So 25 years passed until a professor called Evelyn Forget found the records, did the analysis, and found out that actually it was a huge success.
And by huge success, what are the measures that we're using to determine that?
Okay, a couple of things. So in the first place, a lot of people worry that if you would just give people free money, that they'll just stop working. Now, this is simply not true. So in all the experiments, you see hardly any reduction in work hours. And if there's a little bit of a reduction, it is always compensated by people doing more volunteers work, or caring for the children or caring for the elderly. So that's not something to worry about. And then you've got all the other positive effects, like healthcare costs went down. So the hospitalization rate in Dauphin, this town that I was talking about, dropped by as much as 8.5%. Crime went down. Kids doing much better in school. So the interesting thing here, and this is something that researchers actually found from a similar experiment in North Carolina, is that basic income can be an investment that pays for itself in the long run. Because the reductions in healthcare costs and policing costs, etc., are bigger than the cash grants themselves. So yeah, it doesn't really matter if you whether you're left wing or right wing. I always say that if you don't have a heart, then at least you have a wallet. It makes financial sense as well.
And one of the and I want to touch on in just a moment some of the fascinating history about Nixon, because in addition to the Democrats wanting more, there was another narrative that got developed out of that time inadvertently by Nixon, you write, and I want to touch on that in a moment. But in terms of the policy itself, to what extent, though, and this has been, to the extent that I've heard any critiques of a UBI from the left, it has been a concern of the politics that in some way we saw with Dauphine, which is that you could, folks like Milton Friedman wanted to institute a UBI or a guaranteed basic income, and as a replacement for other forms of support for people living in poverty. And the concern is that if you put all the eggs in that one basket, the ability of that basket to shrink, depending on the political winds, is difficult.
Well, I really see basic income as a directional thought. And there are many, many different versions of basic income. Very exciting and, hopeful. And some of them are just a really bad idea. You have this libertarian version of basic income, which is all about, getting rid of the welfare state as we have it now and just supplanting it with one small cash grant. And don't get me wrong, I think that would be a horrible idea. I mean, I'm from Holland. I know that universal healthcare is a pretty great thing. And public education is also a pretty great thing. So a guaranteed basic income would really be supplement. It would be the crowning achievement of social democracy. So yeah, it's the devil's in the details here. It's important to look at that.
Okay, and so tell us about what Nixon did. I mean, it was fascinating, the idea that he wanted to be the conservative who makes this sort of like highly progressive leap forward, but in his rhetoric, he ended up sort of creating another monster.
Yeah. Well, it's a good example that, if you zoom out a little bit and look at the broader span of history, you just realize that it's really ideas that matter in the long run, right? So it's really hard to imagine right now that in the early 70s, it was this conservative president almost implementing this seemingly radical progressive idea. Now, what happened in that process in the 70s is that it's a pretty bizarre and complicated history. But to summarize it quite quickly, is that Nixon heard something about a report of a sort of basic income-ish-like experiment that happened in the early 19th century, actually, in England, where supposedly they had some kind of basic income that didn't work at all. And that sort of convinced him to change his language. So he started to use the language of workfare, as opposed to welfare. And he started talking a lot about the lazy poor and about the lazy, people who are out of job. And, that was later taken up by Reagan as well. And then we moved into a totally different era. What I've learned from all of this is that history is not governed by big laws, and often it's not governed by, the vested interest either. But coincidences matter a lot, and ideas as well.
So he looks at Speen Hamland in England.
In England,
and thinks that workfare is going to be the easiest way to get this guaranteed basic income in, and it ends up. All that we get from that is this notion of the premise of workfare, that you need to motivate people to work. Let's talk about your other proposal, and that comes from in part, I guess, maybe the Jetsons, in part from Bertrand Russell, the idea of a 15-hour work week. Explain that to us.
Okay, so this idea, it basically goes back to the famous British economist John Maynard Keynes, right? So in 1930, he wrote an essay called economic possibilities for our grandchildren. It's a fascinating read. You can just Google it, economic possibilities for our grandchildren, and your mind may be blown, because he made 2 predictions in that essay. It's just 8 pages long, where he said that in the first place, we're going to be a lot richer, right? So if economic growth continues as it has been, as we've seen it since the 1850s, we'll be a lot richer. And if we just use a little bit of that wealth every year to work a little bit less, then the work week will keep shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and we'll be working less and less and less. And if you don't just extrapolate, we'll have a 15-hour work week in 2030. That was Keynes' prediction, one of the great economists of the 20th century. Now, you could say, I never really liked Keynes anyway, he was this crazy guy. But actually, almost all the experts, all the sociologists, the philosophers, up until the 70s, they all believed that we would be working less and less and less. It's only since around the 1980s that we started working in a hell of a lot more.
Well, what happened? I've spoken on this program about finding an article in a steamer trunk at a yard sale from a futurist. I think it was in the early 60s, addressing a Rotary Club in Florida, talking about how we're all going to be carrying around little TVs, which was accurate. We're going to get beam stuff from the space. He thought at the time they would be powered by kerosene, but so you can't get everything right. But he did say the biggest challenge we're going to have by the year 2000 is what to do with our leisure time, because of the amount of work that we would not need to do. So what happened? I mean, this is what you call, many respects, I think what you call the Great Decoupling. But what happened?
Yeah, well, here's the thing. What we underestimate is capitalism's extraordinary amount, or extraordinary ability, I should say, to come up with new bullshit jobs that simply don't need to exist. To be honest, I can already see this, as someone from Holland, where workers are better protected and we've got a higher minimum wage. You see so many jobs in America that just don't exist in Holland, right? Greeters at a supermarket, so much security, that's not really necessary in my mind, right? So capitalism is really good at inventing all these jobs that don't really need to exist. Now, if you don't believe me, you can ask people themselves, right? We've seen huge polls in the past couple of years. There's now a scientific study done by 2 Dutch economists where they ask people the question, do you think your job adds anything of value to society? Turns out 25% of the modern workforce says, no, I don't add anything of value to society. I could go on strike and no one would care. Now, who are these people? Well, they're not teachers, they're not nurses, they're not care workers. Actually, they're often people with wonderful resumes who went to great universities, who work for banks or for consultancies or you name it. But still, at the end of the day, they have this feeling like my job doesn't contribute anything.
Well, so what? Why is it, in your estimation, is that capitalism in the context of the United States develops these bullshit jobs? I mean, I think we had Graeber on to talk about this some time back. Why do you think it is? I mean, has that been the answer, as opposed to, like, what are the forces that create that dynamic?
Well, I don't think it's about technology or about economics. It's really about ideology. If you have this ideology that goes back to the 19th century, which is all about you have to work for your money, and where we use a very narrow definition of what work actually is. So you have to be in a hierarchical relationship with an employer, and you pay, you get a salary, you pay taxes over that. And that's the only thing we consider work, right? We do not include caring for our kids in GDP. We do not include caring for the elderly in GDP, right? Or all kinds of other volunteers work. Now, if you have this ideology, this belief system about everyone should do this kind of work, and then there's suddenly no work left anymore, right? Because the robots are coming, they're taking more and more jobs. Then you get into this crisis, this ideological crisis, and you just start inventing jobs that don't need to exist. I think that is exactly what we've seen happening in the past couple of decades. And if you want to see what the future can look like, I think you should go to a country like Japan, because Japan has the most robots per capita, right? It's the most technologically advanced society in the world, probably. But then the unemployment rate is the lowest in the whole rich world as well. So how do they do it? Well, you just walk around in Tokyo for a couple of hours and you'll see so many jobs that don't need to exist, right? There are roadworks and there are literally 10 people standing next to it, waving to, go to the left, go to the right. It's absolutely useless. But that's what happens if you have this ideology that everyone needs to have a job.
Well, so where does what is the ideology? Is that a function of capitalism? I mean, it's clearly not just puritanical, or maybe it is, and somehow we exported that to Japan. Is it just a function of capitalism? And what does?
No. Communism had it as well, right? So if you went to the Soviet Union, there was also this ideology that everyone should have a job, right? And you would go to a bakery or something, and you would buy a piece of bread, and there would be someone to give it to you, someone to hand you over the receipt, someone to put it in a bag, right? And just because there's this ideology, we all need a job. I think that's what we need to get rid of. The real goal of the future should be, as one science writer once said, the real goal of the future should be full unemployment, so that we can live the good life, right? That should be the promise of technological progress.
I mean, in some respects, there's a failure of culture too, right? Because there is not enough of a competition for that time. I mean, you mentioned how much people watch TV. I think specifically in this country, but certainly you quote Bertrand Russell. The idea that that our leisure time is really just a way to regenerate for work, as opposed to the development of a rich cultural life that makes pursuing things that aren't for work as easy as sort of like almost like second nature as the idea of like entering the workforce.
Yeah, I agree. But here's the interesting thing. If you compare countries internationally and you look at the countries with the longest work weeks, those are also the countries where people watch the most amount of television, right? Because they work so hard, and then at the end of the day, the only thing you can do is sit back and watch stupid cable news, right? And be brainwashed. If you look at the countries with much shorter working weeks, you'll see that they're also the countries where people go to the theater most often, where they read the most books, where they do most volunteers work, etc. So my conviction is that if people have the time, they can also, live the good life and actually develop their cultural taste, and you name it. But you need the time for it. If you're tired, then the only thing you can do is watch stupid television.